Hello, everybody. It is 9 o'clock on Saturday night Eastern Time. My name is Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical, and I am wearing my Babylon 5 t-shirt today. And so tonight we're going to talk about, tonight I'm solo, by the way. I actually did not get a response back from Lissa. I hope she's okay. I think she's off doing another gig. She's going to be around less than she was before because she's got a paying gig that will interfere some of the times. And so I'm doing this one solo, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Daedalus Class Starship, because I realized as I was putting it together last time that there was a lot more to that ship than I thought there was. And I also realized that I had more to say about that ship than I thought I did. And I did not have time to sort of organize all my thoughts and say everything that I wanted to say. And hence, we're going to do it again tonight. So let me go ahead and get started. Hope everybody's doing well. Careful saluting yourself with the coffee because you might pour it on yourself. And you know what? I think I'm just going to go ahead and drop me off for this one. Because it will make it a little bit easier. I will move it up to my top monitor. Otherwise, if I move it up to my top monitor when I'm on, it looks like I'm staring at the ceiling the entire time, and this will make it a little bit easier for me to see my slides. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. As always, I tell you everything that I'm thinking as I'm doing it. So here's the usual schedule thing that I say. So yeah, 17 May, that's today. We're doing the show. Next week, reply hazy, try again later. I'm officially done with the day job on the current day job as of Wednesday. But the new day job is 500 miles away and I have to move there. But before I move there, I have to buy a house. And so I'm going to be doing some shuttling back and forth to Virginia. And so whether I'm available to do a show or not will depend upon what's going on. I may not know until fairly close to the last moment. So what I'm going to try to spend some time doing this week is put together a couple of shows so that I've got them in my hip pocket. And that way, if I find that I have time to do a show, but not time to prep a show, I can actually do a show then. So that's what my goal is going to be. We'll see if I'm able to make that work the way that I want to make that work. Okay, so next thing on the list is just what I'm potentially going to talk about going forward. Aircraft carriers in space. I've got enough for three different a three-part presentation on that, so that I just need to sort of organize the third part and sort of move things around a little bit. I also want to do an Akira class deep dive, and I want to do probably the next one. I'll do a Starfleet Museum because that directly ties into what we've talked about last week and what we're talking about tonight. So those work. As always, my opinions only, not the opinions of any employer, past, present, or presumably future. And all the images I use are the property of the people who produce them. I'm doing a particularly bad job tonight of telling you where stuff comes from because there's some stuff I just don't know. And I try to include links, but I didn't really do that much with one exception. And so I think everything I'm using is under fair use because I'm going to talk about it. And this is about adding educational value through criticism and commentary. And you know, if I put an image up here in general, it's because I thought it was really cool. So that sounds good. Okay, let's see. Next thing is, let me move forward to the next slide. Okay, so here's the agenda. So first I'm going to talk about why I'm doing the Daedalus class again, because I did it last week. Why am I doing it again? Then I'm going to go through all the versions that I showed you last week and sort of remind you what they are. So in most cases, I just took a slide. Sometimes I deleted some slides, but sometimes I'm just going to throw up a slide that I threw up before. I'm just going to do it really quick this time. And then I've got a few new things that I want to add on, a couple of other versions that I found. And then I want to take a look at, I want to sort of focus a little bit on the inside, on the schematic, possible schematics of this thing. And I'm going to look at the Starfleet Museum version and compare it to the Jackal's version of that. And then I want to go through a handful of issues, sort of talking about the timeline, talking about the size of the ship, because that actually turns out to be one of the biggest issues is nobody can agree what the size of the ship is. The evidence seems to be inconsistent. Want to talk about some of the design features like deflector dish, etc., and warp core feed and where the engine struts go in and things like that. And then I'm going to basically go down, make my suggestions on how, if you're going to redesign this ship, what you should keep in mind when you're redesigning it, what I would like to keep in mind when I'm redesigning it, and why I would keep those things in mind. And then I'm going to go back through some of the ones that we've seen and sort of tell you what I like and what I don't like about them. So that's the plan. And, you know, as always, ask questions as you get them. And I'm looking through the list to see if there's anything that I need to. So Wright asked the question, would this be available for people to come visit me in the Tidewater region? Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be in the greater DC metropolitan area, which means that I will be within striking distance of the USS Wisconsin and the Monitor Museum, and they're both very, very good to go to. And so good evening, Delon. Yeah, you shouldn't talk if you're driving. So that sounds good. And I should say Delon's kids, my niece and nephew, both graduated from undergrad today, I believe, if I remember correctly. I know it was either today or yesterday, whenever they did the ceremony. So congratulations to them. I'm not going back for that because I'm going back for my niece's wedding in October, and I'm going back for the Weuve family reunion in June. That's why on the previous slide it said June 21st is a definite no, because I'm going to try to be in Iowa if I'm not in Virginia. So I know that I'm busy that weekend. I just don't know what I'm busy doing. So Delon says yes today. So give him my best, Delon. And then, and that's it for questions and stuff like that. So let me move on. Okay, so why do the Daedalus class again? So first of all, it's a very important ship in Star Trek history, not Starfleet history, not the in-universe history, but the history of a television show made in the 1960s called Star Trek, in that it was one of the original designs that Matt Jeffries threw down. And there are certain elements of that design that Gene Roddenberry liked. He liked the nacelles, he liked the secondary hull, he liked the primary hull, he just didn't want it to be a sphere. And so it directly influenced the design of the Federation. This is the place where the Starfleet design ethos was born. And so from that standpoint, this ship was an important ship. Now, it wasn't called the Daedalus back then, obviously. They later took this idea of this ship and said, hey, we're going to make that a ship in the history of the universe, where it's a very important ship in Starfleet history also. They later added that. It was been described as the workhorse of the early Federation. It keeps getting retconned into more and more of the history. And so, like, for instance, in all those episodes from the first, from the original series, where there was a Federation starship that was destroyed and Kirk and the boys are out there trying to figure out what was going on with it, they've all been retconned to be a Daedalus class ship. So a Daedalus class ship left the book about Chicago with the Iosians, and they I think it's the Iosians, and they built their society around 1920s Chicago. One of the ships was pulled down by Landru, and all the crew was assimilated by Landru. All these different instances, they've retconned it that it's a Daedalus class ship. So there was a bunch of these ships, and they were very important. Everybody in Starfleet knows the history of those ships. And so I say that this is sort of Starfleet's equivalent of a B-17. The B-17 was not the most produced U.S. bomber in the European theater in World War II. That was the B-24. The B-17 did not have the greatest bomb load of any U.S. bomber in the European theater in World War II. That was the B-24. And almost across the board, the B-24 was a more significant bomber than the B-17. Yet everybody recognized that photo as being a photo of B-17 because everybody recognizes B-17s. When you say bombing campaign in World War II, you think B-17s. And so in universe, when people say early Starfleet, they probably think Daedalus class. They might think NX-01, but they probably think Daedalus class. And so that's why it's significant for us. And most importantly, I got me some ideas about how I would design a Daedalus class. And since I have a show on YouTube, you get to hear my ideas. Bob is correct. The B-17 is prettier and it was more durable. That's the reason why they kept it around. Is that so they at one point they basically said, yeah, we're only going to send B-17s after the hard targets because it was more likely to come back. It was just more durable. But in a lot of ways, the B-24 was a superior airplane. The B-17 was also old. It was a design from like 1935, which in airplane terms in World War II was grandpa. It was the grandpa of airplanes. Okay, so I'm gonna do a quick survey of some of the variants. Here's a bunch of the sketches that Matt Jeffries did to show Gene Roddenberry, and you can clearly see some stuff that looks very much like the Daedalus, including those interesting swept forward nacelle struts, and those show up in some of the various fan designs and stuff that people have done. Some people have noticed that, and they've done swept forward struts. Okay, so this is from the last time, and so I just wanted to show that picture, that sort of default picture that is the one that comes out of The Making of Star Trek by Stephen Whitfield. Okay, Chris Lay's fan film one. Now, Chris Lay also worked on the Axanar movie, about the Daedalus class, but this is not the one he used for the Axanar movie. In all honesty, I prefer this one, I think. And so it's got some interesting things about it. It's got that spine. It's got some extra supports. It's got a huge connecting tube. I like the huge connecting tube. I'm going to talk some more about this one later. It's one of the ones that's going to make it at the end. E.C. Henry's has some interesting things. It's the most significant redesign of the Daedalus that we see from all the different fan film versions out there. He added a second connecting tube. He's mucked with the struts. He's moved the position of the ball. He's done all sorts of stuff with this. It's a nice looking ship, not the perfect ship, nice looking ship. I'm going to talk about it some more too. This is the one that I think is from Lower Decks, because I think they use the Essex there, and that's sort of a more traditional design, but it's got some funky stuff going on with the struts, and it also has some funky stuff going on with the hangar bay at the back. It doesn't just have that sort of vertical surface with a hole in it. It's got like a little landing platform like we see in most Starfleet ships. And this is one of the ones I really like, the Christopher Freeman, also known as Aethernaut. And it's a design that I don't think has ever showed up on YouTube, but it does show up in a couple of other places. And it's got some interesting things: forward swept struts, bigger tube, move things around a little bit. I like it a lot too. And then finally, we've got the Starfleet Museum version. And so that's the Starfleet Museum is an interesting thing. And in the background of that, the bottom ship is the Daedalus, and it was derived from the top ship. I have a hard time pressing the I believe button on that, but that's what they did for the background. And supposedly the top ship fought during the Earth Romulan War, and the bottom ship was immediate post-war build. And so this is more what the three different views of or four different views, I guess, of that one from the Starfleet Museum. And let's take a couple of looks at what they ended up doing for Axanar. There's one that was recommissioned for the 4 Years' War as a hospital ship. You can see the big caduceus on the front. And here's another one from Axanar showing the changes that they made. I think the one on the left shows it going into the dry dock, and the one on the right shows it as it's deployed. And they made some changes to the aft end of the ship. So a new one, this one is one that Alec brought up while we were talking. And this is a cutaway view by a guy named Matthew Cushman, and it's got some interesting things in there. One of the things that you'll notice, and so this is a cutaway. We've got some other things that are cutaways. In all these different places where you see the cutaways, nothing internal is in the same location, not even the bridge. The only thing that doesn't change in all of it is the shuttle bay. It doesn't change, but that's kind of interesting. It's also unclear to me what those things are in the back. In fact, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger on my monitor to double check. I just realized there was a number there. Yeah, I can't tell if it actually says that there are missiles in that bay in the back or not. The one thing is labeled access hatch, and it sort of looks like there's missiles. And some of the fan films show them loading missiles in there. And there's at least some commentary that they were using like old Titan missiles or old Trident missiles, and it just didn't make any sense to me for about 1,000 different reasons. But it's a nifty cutaway, and it sort of gives you an idea of what the size is. I said the word size. Hold that thought. Okay, here's a new one that I like a lot, and I'm going to come back and talk about him again later. Mad Koi Fish did this design that's got it's a very sort of it definitely pays homage to the original, but it's beefed up in a couple of places, and I think it's just balanced better, and I like the strut placement a little bit better. Okay, I said we were going to talk about Jackal. So here's the Jackal's version. This one comes from 1994. So this predates the Starfleet Museum. Starfleet Museum was late 90s was when the articles were first started writing, and it sort of came together around 2000, 2001, i.e. very shortly before Enterprise was when Starfleet Museum came up. In the intro to the website, he says something, or it's to the effect of I expect that Enterprise is going to make a lot of the website OBE. So he was clearly writing the intro before Enterprise was out, or at least had done enough to sort of change the timeline, or change all the background stuff. This is sort of a standard cutaway that you can see the Franz Joseph influences in that. You see something that looks like there's some hidden sensors or some hidden deflector dish down below. I'm going to point that out later. They've got a huge botanical section because that's the thing apparently that you do on a very tiny spaceship. You waste a significant amount of time planting some trees. I don't understand why they do that, but okay, I guess if they have to. And you don't really see anything that looks like a warp core. You don't really see anything that indicates that they make the warp plasma in the secondary hull and then pipe it to the nacelles. It all appears to be done in the nacelles. So this is from the article on Starfleet Museum, and as I say, I would recommend that you visit the actual website to make things big enough. I didn't bother doing that because it's actually not as useful as it might be. And the reason why is that it's only sort of, it's a little bit labeled, but it's not as labeled as much as I would like. But it sort of gives you the idea of how many decks they think they have. They think that this thing has 11 decks. And as we'll see when we get to the size section, there's a lot of discrepancy between how many decks this has. The low end is 10 and the high end is 18. And when you make some assumptions about, okay, how tall are the decks? Are they 2.5 meters? Is it really sort of claustrophobic? Is it a 3-meter deck? You know, when you sort of make some decisions about that, you know, you could end up with something that's relatively small or relatively or much larger. And I'll also point out he's got in his backstory, there's 2 different versions of the ship. There's a Block 1 version and a Block 2 version. And so the one on the left is the representative of the Block 1 version, and the stuff on the right is the Block 2 version. There's some commonality between some of the stuff. Like he says, decks 1 through 4 are identical on both blocks, and then some things change. But it's really kind of hard to see in any significance what the changes are. The big one is that pink stuff is the weapons fit. And so the big change is that the Block 2 has a lot more missiles to fire. And as a result, some other stuff got moved around. Okay, so let's compare these things together against each other and see what they look like together. I've sized them so that the spheres are the same size. Or actually, no, that's not true. I sized them so the ships are the same length from end of engine nacelle to the tip of the nose. And the sphere when you do that, the sphere for the Starfleet Museum version ends up being a little bit bigger. And you'll see that there's a big discrepancy in the size of the secondary hull. And there's sort of a discrepancy in terms of how many levels they think they are in there, and a few other things. So the short answer is probably they're not really the same size. They're not really the same size. And it's worth pointing out also that I overlap some of that text. I didn't mean to do that. That gray structure in the middle of the top one, in the middle of the sphere, is not the computer core. It is a ship structure of some sort and ship services. The computer core is the green section at the front of the sphere on deck 3. That is the computer on that version. Also, those plus signs that you see in the secondary hull and the primary hull, that just indicates that it's the center line. And so in both cases, it's an indication of the horizontal center and the vertical center where they intersect. Okay, let me go take a look for questions and stuff like that. Yeah, it does almost look like the development of this Discovery one, sort of from 2001. Now, it's a little bit outside of the realm of what I usually talk about, but I would at some point like to do a discussion about, I assume you mean Discovery from 2001. It reminds me a bit about how I've always thought the design of the Discovery was kind of jacked up too, in that the centrifuge is not in the biggest part of the sphere, which is naturally the place where you'd want to make it so that you can make the centrifuge as big as possible so you can keep the rotation rate as low as possible. And so there's a bunch of other things where basically I would make the argument they got the orientation off by 90 degrees in the sphere of the Discovery. So I should do an odds and ends show and pull that in and do a little bit on that. Let's see. Bob says he likes Cushman's cutaway. I do too. Yeah, a 9 megaton warhead from a Titan missile would be enough to vaporize a Romulan warbird. The problem I had with the idea of, like, he talked about firing Trident, so, like SLBM. So I think I misspoke when I said Titan, because I don't think he said Titan. I think he said Trident. But the thing is, like I wouldn't want to fire a 300-year-old missile or a 200-year-old missile, first of all. And second of all, the level of performance of that thing looks pretty good for us on Earth, but it doesn't look very good for these guys, right? The performance would be really, really low. And why would you use 200-year-old technology? I mean, it's really kind of at the level of saying, we'll build an Arleigh Burke class destroyer and then hand all the people on board flintlocks to use for when they go ashore. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. But you can see there's a different number of decks. You can see that it's the old style we see in the Jack Hill one. It's the old style. The reactor is part of the nacelle version. It's not the more distributed power system that was introduced with Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And, you see something that looks like a deflector, and I would argue there's something that looks like a deflector down in the Jack Hill's version too. It's the thing that sort of looks like part of a capsule that's directly aligned with the tube. That's sort of, there's an equivalent structure in the Franz Joseph design blueprints that kind of looks like that. And so, okay, you've got these deflectors. Where do they get the power for these deflectors from? There's nothing that looks like a hardcore power conduit of any sort, or a plasma conduit or something like that. Remember, deflectors use a lot of energy. So where do they get the power from it from? I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Okay, so let's talk about the issues. There's an infinite number of issues that we could talk about, and there's a lot of different drawings. So I could spend a lot of time going through in great depth on all of the different issues here. I'm not going to. I'm just going to look at a few that I want to highlight later on. when I start talking about how I would design this thing. And so there's three themes that are going to kind of come out in this section of it. And none of these are going to be a surprise to anybody who's watched the show more than twice. And those themes are, I really think that the inside and the outside should match. And the second is, the way that you get the inside and the outside to match is that the outside is dictated by the inside and not the other way around. And so we see these absolutely crazy designs like the Gagarin class research ship, where it's got a secondary hull that I have no idea how people actually get to the secondary hull, because it's practically detached. It's just got thin struts. So does everybody just climb down a ladder to get to the secondary hull? I've always thought that was the dumbest design possible. It looks cool, but I don't understand how you fit all the stuff inside the hull and how you get from point A to point B and how the big structures work and how you optimize the flow of warp plasma to where the warp plasma needs to go. I don't understand any of that stuff in that ship. And so I'm a big believer that you've got systems that are a certain size, they have to be in a certain configuration, and you design the ship around those systems as a general rule. Right? You design around the big rocks, you put some smaller rocks into the holes in between the big rocks, and then you put in some sand, and then maybe you put in some water, and you can get everything to fit that way, but you have to design around the big rocks. An aircraft carrier is designed around the flight deck. The flight deck is not just something they added on. It's designed around the engine room. It's designed around the hangar bay. These aren't just things that they came up with something cool and then said, well, where can we put a hangar bay? No, you design around it. And the last thing is also pretty obvious, which is I got me some ideas about the right way to design Starfleet ships. And so I think there's some things that make a lot of sense, and they're based upon reading Sternbach and Okuda and talking to Andy Presby and Pat Doyle and sort of filtering through them. But I've got some ideas about how to design Starfleet ships. And so let's talk about that. So I'm going to look at a little bit of the timeline / class history of these things, just to let you know what the issues are there. But I'm going to spend more time focusing on size and deflector dish and warp core feed. Let's see. So timeline class history stuff. So everybody agrees that these ships came out around the time of the Romulan War. Most of them say that their heyday was after the war. Some say that their heyday, that they fought in the war. In fact, a lot of them actually say they fought in the war, but that they formed the core of the exploration fleet afterwards. So in most cases, it is that the NX-01 came first, and then these ships came later. And the explanation for why these look cruder than the NX-01 is that they were cranking these things out. These were the inexpensive ship that they either produced during wartime, or they were the inexpensive ship that they produced when they were sort of rebuilding after the war. And the NX-01 was sort of a thoroughbred, and these things were the workhorses. And so they just sort of cranked them up. And so on average, most of the people say this is the follow-on to the NX-01, and that maybe it fought during the war, but it was the follow-on. Some describe it as being a Warp 5 ship, which the NX-01, if I remember correctly, was a Warp 4 ship. Now, the Axanar version of this is that the Daedalus class did fight in the Romulan War, and then they were mothballed eventually. That's why they were available to turn into hospital ships. I think the Starfleet Museum version of the history is as good as any. In fact, it's probably the longest of all the different histories that we see. They claim it was based on the Comet class cruiser, which was the ship that fought in the war. So they actually stand out in that they don't say that the Daedalus class fought in the war. They say that it's basically the descendant of a ship that fought in the war. The Block 1s were built specifically for exploration. The Block 2s added some increased combat capability. There's a nifty little side piece in there about how there was the exploration agency, and then there was the Navy. And when when they got combined for purposes of the war. And the hope was that when the Federation was formed, because, hey, we're going to do this Federation thing, the hope was with all the exploration people that they'd get spun out again. And to their chagrin, Starfleet had an exploration mission in addition to having to owning the military mission. And so they got to continue being part of the service with Starfleet. And that early on, they, hey, we need some exploration ships. And so they built some of the Block 1 ships, but the military part of Starfleet said, hey, we like that design. We need to increase it so that it can be used as one of the combat ships. And as a result, they increased the missile armament and did a few other things. The article goes on to say that the ship actually had a lot of problems, despite the fact they built 35 of them or whatever, and they were the workhorse. They were relatively small, they were relatively cramped. They had a science staff that only was about 25 people. Everybody else was just running the ship. And there's also this nifty little story about how there were reactor problems with long-term continuous use, that the ships really weren't designed to do 5-year missions, 5 or 6 year missions. And they discovered that deep into those missions, they started having problems, and that they lost a bunch of the ships. The claim, I think this is the source where they said they lost 11 out of the 35 ships, mostly in cases where they didn't necessarily know what happened, because they're alone and unafraid before subspace warp radio relays and everything else. This was like, if you were far enough out and you had a problem, they never figured out what happened, except 200 years later, the Enterprise intercepts a message and goes and discovers that you were eaten by Landru or something like that. And so in the story version of this, the Starfleet Museum version of this, they decide that they're having a problem. And they go, oh, quick, everybody go to a starbase. We need to do like a major inspection. And when they do the major inspection, they discover that several of them have reactors that are more degraded than they thought they were. And that basically they were ticking time bombs waiting to go off, and that they could have lost a lot more ships. And like I said previously, they've been retconned into the early history, especially references in TOS. Now there's a lot of sources that say that all these other ships that they keep hearing about ships disappearing, that they were all Daedalus class ships. Yeah, okay. So a bunch of people corrected me about NX-01 being the first Warp 5 ship. Roger that. Let's see. Wright says self-repair would have to be a capability for any deep explorer. Yeah, I mean, or the ability to be repaired by the crew on board, right? So the question is, what exactly does that mean? By the time you get to next generation, you're constantly running level 2 diagnostics sort of automatically to make sure that everything's good, and you're manufacturing basically whatever part you need that's smaller than a warp core by using some sort of replicator, etc. This is a time period where there's a lot less technology than that. So I'm thinking that there's basically somewhere in there's a machine shop and they're building their own parts. And so I'm thinking it's looking a lot more like an aircraft carrier or a battleship. It's just got more capability than a current aircraft carrier or battleship, because they're probably doing the equivalent of 3D printing as opposed to the equivalent of subtractive manufacturing and machining off stuff. They're not using lathes, they're building stuff up, but it's still kind of the same idea. It's a very manual intensive process. And that's one of the reasons why they talk about they had a small science staff that basically, I think these guys said they had a crew of 100 and 125, and basically like 103 were just people keeping the ship from falling apart. It was something like that. Yeah, Wright says that basically what I just said was what he really meant. So yeah, I totally agree. I don't think it's going to be an automated self-repair capability in this time period, because we don't really see that in the original series. And this is a little bit before that. Okay, so let's talk about size. All of the images on this page come from the Ex Astra Scientia article called Daedalus Class Problems, and there is the URL. But if you just type Daedalus Class Problems into Google, you will find it. And so on the upper left-hand corner, we have some comparisons with different size Daedalus classes based upon what you see. In the lower left-hand corner, I pulled some numbers from a couple of sources, some of which I didn't check directly, that I got from the article. Like, for instance, I didn't look in the Star Trek Encyclopedia. I assumed that Bernd Schneider, something like that, the guy who runs Astra Scientia, was correct when he said that the Star Trek Encyclopedia said a length of 105. In TNG, they specifically mentioned the Daedalus has a crew of 229. The Block 2 from the Starfleet Museum. So there's a wide disparity of sizes there. Jackal should say 104 meters, not 140, not 1040. So apologies there. So that's a pretty good disparity from 104 to 140. And I seem to recall seeing a source, and I couldn't find it when I went looking for it. I want to say I saw a source that said something like 187 or something really large. 104 is smaller than like a U.S. Navy attack submarine. You get to 140, and now you're talking about something that's still smaller than say a Trident submarine, but it's bigger. At least it's longer than an attack submarine. And so there's a wide variety of sizes on this. On the right-hand side, we see an illustration of that, where how many decks does this thing have? And so basically what he did is he took some of the information that came from various sources and said, okay, how many decks do I think this have? How far apart do I think the decks are, et cetera? And then he did window analysis. Can I make the windows line up? And there's a few places where there are some windows that are problematic. I am less willing to automatically say that just because a window's out of place, and that means that doesn't mean the decks are lined up properly, because I fully think that there's places where you might have catwalks and stuff like that, and so the windows might actually be at a slightly different height because the deck actually has some minor thing in that area. Like on a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, there's a point at which, if you're heading in a particular part of the ship, if you're heading outboard, you get to a place where you go down 3 stairs and you walk 10 feet and then you go up 3 stairs. Why is that? Why does it just have this in the middle of the corridor? Well, if you look up, what you're looking up at is the bottom of the catapult. And so there's something hanging down out of the ceiling. And so rather than adjust all the decks and make there's just this place where they do that. And I forget exactly how they make it all fit in that regard, but they just do that, and in order to prevent you from bonking your head on the bottom of the catapult, on the catapult structure. It's not the catapult structure is pretty good size. And so we end up with a bunch of different options there. In fact, there's where the 180 is. If you assume that it's got 18 decks and that it's 3-meter decks, then you end up with a total length of 180 meters. I think he said that he concluded that the 15 is probably the right answer, which would make it about 140 meters if you had not quite 3-meter decks. And so he's playing with the deck size a little bit to try to get the windows to line up. Now, I'll note in a couple of places, like there are places in the world where you have windows down low and not necessarily up high because you're using the window to monitor something. The most classic example that comes to mind is helicopters. Right? If you've ever seen the front of a helicopter, there are windows down low. And that's because the pilot needs to see the ground. And you see the same thing in other airplanes too. Occasionally there's a window in the cockpit, not in like airliners, but like military planes. Occasionally there's a window down low, so that you can like see out of the airplane and sort of have an idea of what's going on for a particular thing down low. And so I could easily see situations where on some of the decks, you know, especially since it's curving, that putting a window down low so that you can look down and you can actually see down as opposed to just out might be useful. Like maybe for docking or something like that. I don't know, like the Starfleet equivalent of an underway replenishment or something, it might be useful. Yeah, Chris Bazell says Stuka's had an equivalent thing to line up for lining up stuff. Let's see. He also asked the question, are you going to try to tackle the bigger on the inside that Discovery has inside the hull where the lifts go through? No, I generally avoid the Kurtzman verse and I avoid the JJ verse in that regard. I think it's incredibly, that's one of the reasons why. I think it's incredibly silly that you've got these wide open spaces with elevators going through, that it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Now, I'll note for the record that I do think that most of the people who do deck plans don't understand how real world ships work. And while I'm not a big believer in, you know, you just sort of take it and slavishly reproduce it, there is one thing that I think that people should have a better understanding of, and it is applicable here. And that is, in the real world, you've got engineering spaces and you got the people spaces. And in the people spaces, what you see a lot of times is like decks, and it's sort of split into rooms and stuff like that. And less than you think there is as a general rule, because you might not notice that there's an area that doesn't really have any doors into it, and there's like a big void space there. And that's because that's an elevator, that's an ammunition lift going from the deep magazine up to the flight deck of the aircraft carrier, and you just don't know that it's there. But in general, you know, it's hallways and it's rooms and stuff like that. You go down in the engineering spaces, and a lot of times what you see are big machines in big rooms with catwalks around them to access parts of the machine. Like if you go aboard one of the Battleship Museum ships and you go down into engineering, that's essentially what you've got. Now, it's not wide open like you see in the Kurtzman verse when they're looking inside the primary hull. It's still pretty cramped, but it's basically a big high bay type space with equipment mounted in it and catwalks around it. And the guy who did the insides of the ships for the Starfleet Museum, his specific thinking is he wants to line up bulkheads between levels, because if he does that, then you've got the opportunity of doing a high bay. You can just take the floor out, either in refit or in design. You can take that floor out, that decking out, and you've got a space that's twice as high, and now you can put a big piece of gear there. And so this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, is that this really is about fitting the outside around the ship. Right? Do the inside first, fit the outside around it. And so, yeah, he says something about making it modular. Yeah, it does help make it modular too, in that regard. And it also, it affects like where things go above it. Like there's a place, if you go into the ship store in a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, there's a couple of places where there are no racks of stuff, and there's like a big cap with a bunch of bolts on it, and and sort of a thick glass plate. It's dark down there. I don't know. There must be some powerful lights down there, but it's like a thick cap there. And I want to say there's 2 of those in that space. And those are access points to the nuclear reactor. You're right over the nuclear reactor. And if you look up, you can see that there's a section of the deck that's bolted in place. and they can take the bolts out, and this is how they recore the ship, recore the reactor. They can pull reactor assemblies up through that section. Now, they don't go all the way up to the flight deck. I don't know. I never went looking on the hangar deck to see if there's something there. It might be that they have to actually do hot work and cut a hole to get the stuff out in that case. But they're clearly thinking about, what do I put over this space? Because I know that at some point I'm going to, like every 20 years or thereabouts, I'm going to have to do this really serious major evolution and move some big pieces of gear. And so they don't, they keep the way clean. There's also a sign that says this space is not to be used for birthing. So I thought that was interesting. So that's the sort of things that I think are especially going on in the secondary hull of starships. I think the primary hull most of the time probably has a lot of things that look like regular decking, and it's pretty regular, et cetera, and you got a bunch of rooms. I think when you go down to the secondary hull, it's catwalks everywhere, and it's big pieces of gear. I mean, you sort of see that in engineering and next gen, right? The warp core is a pretty big piece of gear, and it extends through multiple decks. And so they clearly designed that space around that warp core. They didn't just say, okay, now where do we put the warp core? Where can we fit it? It's like, no. They fit the people parts around the warp core. Okay, let's see. Is there anything else that I want to say about this? No. This sort of gives you, like I said, it gives you an idea of like the size controversies in this. It can be a lot of different sizes. Okay, so let's take a look at the deflector dish issue. I've circled here the two things that I think are deflector dishes. One of them is pretty obvious. The other one looks a lot like the equivalent structure on the Franz Josef blueprints. Now, I will note, I can't remember if it says deflector in the Franz Josef blueprints or if it says sensors. If you recall, if you go back far enough to Stephen Whitfield's book, the main deflector dish is labeled main sensor. The idea that that's the deflector is a later retcon that's now official. I mean, it was retconned by I think in TNG they started calling that the deflector, and they've changed everything, but that isn't necessarily the way that Franz Josef was thinking about it. And Jack Hill looks like he just sort of plopped it in place. There's some evidence in some sources, I think, that maybe originally people thought there was a deflector on the front of the secondary hull, but everybody seems to have come to the conclusion that, yeah, that doesn't quite work because of the sphere. Now, it's not immediately apparent to me that when you've got something that's manipulating subspace, that sphere is really in the way. You'd be surprised at the things you can put in front of a radar and it doesn't affect it at all. You look at that and go, isn't that going to block stuff? And it's like, nope, doesn't do that. That's not how that works. And so I think it's entirely feasible. It's reasonable to think that maybe you could actually have the deflector on the front of the secondary hull, and then the whole thing ends up looking much more like a very simple Constitution class with a spherical primary hull. But nobody seems to have gone down that route. And so now that I've mentioned that as a possibility, let's ignore that. And there's at least one source that said something to the effect of there's a deflector dish there, and it's hidden behind a panel that is transparent to whatever wavelengths that the deflector dish is using. But it's there, but you just can't see it. It's hiding behind something. Let's see. I'm going to take a look here real quick. There appears to be a side discussion about whether Jerry's Kitchen and Seinfeld actually works. There's a whole bunch of things that just don't work in in television shows and stuff like that. I challenge you to make the inside of the submarine and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea match the outside. They can't even agree on how many decks that submarine has. And another big one is there's no way that you can make the inside of the Eagle from Space 1999 match the outside. There's just no way. First of all, the sets in the model are different scales. They just clearly are different scales. And so you physically can't make it work. And then in the cockpit, you have problems where if everybody was actually sitting where the claim is that how it's set up, the windows are actually above the sight line of the pilot. It's not in front of him, it's up above his head. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Chris Buzel says, shuttle bay was always an issue from the start of production. That's why they invented the transporter. It's actually kind of interesting if you go back. In one of the earlier episodes, I did something about exactly about that part of the ship. And I looked at the We Travel by Night video, which is definitely, if you're not watching that channel, you need to watch that channel. He does these great little videos where he goes in depth on an issue like that. And one of them is, what's the actual size of that hangar bay? What should the size of that hangar bay be? And the answer is it needs to be a lot bigger than you see in the original series. And if you go and you look at the retcon version of it, the remastered version of the original series, the hangar bay's a lot smaller. It's a lot smaller and tighter. And you also run into some issues with the nacelle struts coming in because, the warp engines are really, really big pieces of gear. They're going to be connected to something that's a main structural frame. If you look at the Franz Josef blueprints, it looks like basically they're just sort of, bolted onto the skin of the secondary hull. There doesn't appear to be any structural frame behind that. And that's clearly wrong. That's clearly wrong. Yeah, Randall Wong says we never really see the parking area of the TOS hangar bay. Franz Josef says that there's an elevator and they go down and the parking area is down below. I'm not sure I believe that either. Okay, moving on from deflector dish, let's take a look at the warp core feed engine strut placement. Okay, so the deflectors are warp field generators. We know that from the Holy Writ, Sternbach and Okuda, and they need lots of power. So where do they get the power from? Where's the power conduit for that? By the time of next gen, you're moving warp plasma around, so you've got a very high density power source, and you're shuttling it throughout the ship, and you've got this direct line directly to the main deflector. In fact, they put the warp core right next to the main deflector, so it can power the main deflector. I did an episode, maybe even two, where I went and looked at all those issues in various versions of retcons of the original series Enterprise. I've been talking a lot about Franz Josef designs. I grew up in the Franz Josef blueprints. They were one of my most treasured purchases as a child. I think I got them with birthday money one year, and I absolutely loved them. And they are so very wrong. They are so very wrong, especially in the secondary hull. And so it gets into questions of where is engineering and what's the power supply look like, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue that in those ships, there is basically a structure, a fairly continuous structure that goes from right where the nacelles are all the way forward to the deflector dish along the center line of the ship. Later on, when they went to the movie era Enterprise, they moved it up. But at that point, it seems to me it's right along the center line of the ship. That totally makes sense because the nacelles connect to the secondary hull. If you extend them, they go right through the axis of rotation. So it looks like they're extending to the center of that, and it goes all the way forward right to the center of the deflector dish. And that entire assembly is you're powering both the nacelles and you're powering the deflector dish. How are they powering the deflector dish here? Even if you think that these are engines that have the warp reactor in the engine itself, as opposed to in the secondary hull. You still need to get the power out of the engine and into the deflector dish. And so okay, maybe there's a really thick electrical cable there, but I really wonder about that. There certainly is nothing that looks consistent with what we've seen with other Star Trek design. I also don't understand why you would connect the nacelles to the neck of the thing. If you look at a lot of those designs, it's clearly connected to the neck tube. It's not connected to the secondary hull, and that doesn't make any sense to me. I also wonder about the entire potentially running a plasma tube through the people tank. I'm not a big fan of that, at least back in this time period. And now I think that also, I can easily tell myself the story. I can easily retcon this, that, believing the Starfleet Museum version, they lost a bunch of ships to what looked like might have been reactor accidents. And at some point along the lines, they came and they pulled them all off the line and sort of tore them apart and went, oh my God, these were disasters waiting to happen. We're lucky we caught it. And my guess is that you end up with a situation where they sit down and they look at the safety manual and they rewrite the safety manual. They rewrite the standards, the construction standards. That happened with the U.S. Navy after the loss of USS Thresher. They implemented a program called SubSafe. And the SubSafe program made a lot of changes that had absolutely nothing to do with the loss of the USS Thresher. But their feeling was, we've gotten too lackadaisical about safety, and they sort of cranked up the safety dial to 11 across the board and wrote an entirely new set of standards. And it included things like no fault ceilings, because fault ceilings hide the source of the damage, right? You've got water coming down from the ceiling. Where's the water coming from? I can't tell. There's a pipe up there that's burst, but I don't know exactly where it is, right? And so no fault ceilings. They got rid of all that stuff. And there's a whole bunch of other things they did with SubSafe. The only reason I can think of why you might want to run the plasma conduit, so close to the people tank, and especially in that one narrow walkway that connects the two parts of the ship, is like, if you thought that you had to do maintenance on it, you want to make it human accessible to do maintenance on it. Right? You don't put something, you don't seal something in a cave that you need to have to go and lube every now and then. And so maybe there's something going on there. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, Rick over. Okay, so I'm going to go through some of my design suggestions. So focus on functionality first. I kind of like the idea of a larger design. I like the idea of a warp core in a secondary hull. So let's pretend there's a warp core in the secondary hull that has to feed the nacelles and has to feed the deflector dish. I want to minimize the plasma piping, and I want that straight path to that deflector if I can possibly get it, because you don't want to make it more complicated than you want to. Now, if Andy Presby were here, and he will say this when he does his power talk, there's actually sound physics reasons why you want to have bends in your plasma conduit. Because basically, for physics reasons, the place where you want to tap something is at like a 90-degree angle. When it hits a 90-degree angle, that's an excellent place to put in a tap. So maybe you want to put some 90-degree angles in there. You need to remember that there's an internal structure there. So we're not seeing the ribs of the ship. We're not seeing the girders and stuff like that. There has to be stuff there to make this work, especially since nobody talks about structural integrity fields in this time period. So I think it's even more important. And you need to remember that both people and plasma needs to be able to get through that neck. And so once you do that, then let's talk about the rule of cool. And let's try to balance the ship, because some people have thought that certain versions of the ship look unbalanced with the big ball up front, and you can do things to balance the ship, make the ball bigger or smaller. Now I'm going to go back and look at some of my favorites. Now, I do want to say something about this image, though. This image comes from Chris Weuve. He did a 3D model. This is from a video. he did a 3D model of a fake desk ornament, you know, like a model that you could buy for your desk, of the 3D model that he did for his little video, which I think is just utterly fantastic. It's a 3D model. It's a desk model version, a virtual desk model version of a virtual model. And it's very nice looking. And, you know, I was really disappointed because at first I thought I had stumbled across somebody that was actually selling these and I was going to buy one. Yeah, it's just an in-universe joke. Okay, so Mad Koi Fish, let's start there. There's a lot of things I love about this design. It really does appear to be that the neck tube, and hence the plasma conduit in the neck tube, is aligned with the deflector. So there's a nice straight path to get to the deflector. I think that's fantastic. The neck is a little bit bigger than some of the ones we see in the other ones, so it looks like there's ample space for people in plasma. There is I like the way the struts are connected. So you've got a little bit of a spine on the back of the secondary hull, and the struts connect a little bit farther back. And so the implication to me there is that, you know, like there's a big assembly right around that point, and they're close to the big assembly. And I can easily envision that there's a manifold there that's got a junction that has the main pipe coming in from the warp core. It's got one going out to each of the nacelles, and then it's got another one in an angle going forward to the deflector. The manifold like that makes total and complete sense to me, and I know exactly where you'd put it in that ship. I think the design is relatively balanced. I think it doesn't look like it's about to tip over or anything like that. I like that there's some tapering on the secondary hull that's very reminiscent. You know, it's calling out to what we're foreshadowing, what we're going to see in the next generation of starships. I think that's a nice touch. And I kind of look at this and I go, this thing manages to look crude and sophisticated at the same time. I think the earlier Daedalus design just really kind of looks crude. Whereas this, I think, this is a nice balance. I think it balances the aesthetic pretty well. Okay, Aethernauts version. So this one is a little bit lower resolution, but it doesn't have that blue background on it. It shares a lot of the same things that we see with the other one. It's pretty well aligned with the deflector dish. It's got a nice, I think, reasonably straight path. In fact, it may even be better aligned than the previous one in that regard, in terms of like lining up with the structure in the secondary hull. The neck seems to be reasonably good size, not quite as big as the last one, I don't think. I think it's got a pretty good strut connection there. You notice the little swept forward taper, so you clearly saw those, the stuff from Matt Jeffries. There's a little bit of taper in the secondary hull. I also like the fact that it's got something that's reminiscent of a cruder version of what we see in the Constitution class, with sort of the overhang in the back. And once again, I think it manages to look crude and sophisticated at the same time. Armor the power conduits too, please. Yes. And Randall Wog said, add rocks to your plasma conduits. I'm pretty sure that that's a reference to the fact that anytime there's something damage on the bridge, rocks fall from the ceiling. I don't know what those are. When did this design layout first appear compared to the Odyssey in 2001? So I think I don't know when 2001 started their production. The show came out in 1968, and Star Trek came out in what, 64, 65, 65, 66, 67, I think were the years for Star Trek. Or it was 66, 67, 68. So I think it is likely that the Matt Jeffries preliminary drawings were done before the preliminary drawings for the Discovery in 2001, and they went through a lot of different designs for the Discovery. There's a great Discovery 2001 art book that I just got last week. Actually, I got it. I went and picked it up. The Amazon had left it out my front door. I picked it up about a half hour before the show started, and it's got a lot of the preliminary designs, and it's really pretty cool. Discovery, of course, has the neck come in right on the equator of the sphere, so it's a little bit different in that regard. And so I don't know what the thing is with spheres in the late 60s. Everybody appears to have gravitated towards them. I don't know. Oh, that's an interesting theory. I'm gonna throw this up. Olive says my theories of the rocks is fragments like safety glass when it power overloads, so people aren't hit with sharp things. That could be. I'm thinking it's some sort of insulation thing, but I've never. Let me think about that. Okay, next one is the Chris Weuve version, and so I really like this one. I love the big tube. I love the subsidiary conduits. I love the fact that there's sort of a spine on the back that goes back to give a little bit extra structure connecting it all. I love the extra structural support. I can't. There's nothing bad I can say about this design. I think it's really got a lot going for it. Well, there's almost nothing bad I can say about this design. I don't like the very rear end. There's a hatch there that really just sort of looks like it's painted on, and I think the rear is kind of boring, and so I would like to see a little bit more on the back end of it. But once again, I think it manages to look crude and sophisticated at the same time. But I think it looks like the power conduit goes straight to that deflector. I mean, I can easily see a power conduit doing that. I could maybe see moving things around a little bit, because I can also see the idea that the power conduit is actually in that spine portion that doesn't really seem to have any windows on it, right? Keep the plasma away from the people if you possibly can. And then, of course, there's the E.C. Henry version. And so I look at this and I go, I think it's simultaneously the strongest and weakest design. And the reason why I think I say weakest is I think when he moved the sphere down, he was trying to balance it better, and I don't think he balanced it better. I think he moved it too far down. And that's why I've got that little inset there that shows what I would do with that sphere. I would move the sphere up. And I like the extra conduits. I sort of like it, the beefiness of it. The implication of having the two, it looks like there's a plasma conduit down below that doesn't have any windows, and then up above there's the people conduit, and it's got windows because, keeping the people away from the plasma. I like how the struts connect to the main hull. I kind of like the fact that there's impulse engines there. I don't like that angle on the struts. That's not as apparent in this one, but there's a curve there. It doesn't just change direction at the impulse engine box. There's an actual curve to it, and I don't understand why that curve is there. I do like adding the impulse engines. The way I would change this is, first of all, I think I would swap the necks. I would put the people tube on the bottom, and I put the plasma tube on top. So I put the smaller one on top, and I put the bigger one on the bottom. And then I would raise the sphere so the bottom of the plasma conduit aligns with the deflector. And so I'd raise, you can see what I would do with that. So imagine in that inset that I've swapped the two tubes, and now I've raised it up so the equator of the sphere is right along that top tube. I think that is more aesthetically balanced, and I think it meets my engineering goal of having the plasma conduit go right into the deflector. Although he's really close as is. If that is the plasma conduit, he's really close as is of having it go right into the center line of the deflector. It's certainly coming in within. It's coming in like at the bottom of the deflector dish, and okay, maybe you can't have the power come directly in. Maybe there's a gizmo there, right? And so it's got to be all in line and connected, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to have the same center line all the way through. Okay, so let me go look real quick. I think that might actually be the nice last slide. That was the last slide. So let me remove that. Let me put me back up. Let me put me back up. Let me look at questions here. Yeah, Kubrick could never make up his mind on anything. Yeah, it's interesting. Kubrick was famous for doing dozens of takes. For the scene in Clockwork Orange where they assault the woman in her home with her husband watching, he made her film that scene like 70 times. Ridley Scott, on the other hand, is famous for, if he does a third take, it's notable. He usually is good with one take or two. And I've really liked some Kubrick movies, but I've really liked some Ridley Scott movies more than I've liked Kubrick movies. So, okay. Okay, so let's see. One Horse Shay says, are we assuming that Enterprise happened for the Daedalus and suddenly can do Warp 7? And Earth didn't make any advancements for the next. I don't think Daedalus could do Warp 7. I think Daedalus was like a Warp 5 ship. I think Daedalus was a Warp 5 ship that could do sustained Warp 5, and it was cheaper to build. And so I think that's what made Daedalus special, is that they could sort of just crank them out. And the other thing to keep in mind, I think, is that we talk about a Warp 5 ship, right? Like speed is the be all and end all, but there's also this idea of sustained speed, right? The F-22, we've deployed fighters that are faster than the F-22. But the thing about the F-22 is that it can super cruise. It can go fast for a long period of time. Because it can go fast. It can break the sound barrier without being on afterburner. So it can do 1.5 way, way longer than like an F4 Phantom could. And so, if you just sort of look at some of the stats, you'd say, oh, well, the Phantom's better. It's faster. It's like, well, I can't remember if it's actually faster or not. But I mean, my point is that we have deployed stuff that's faster. I think Eagles were faster, if I remember correctly. But they can't do super cruise. And so when you sort of look at stuff like that, I could easily see that the issue isn't just making something faster. The issue is having sustained speed. That's one of the things that I've always said about Explorer class ships. And so that's why I think you need a deflector for an Explorer class ship, is because you need a big deflector, because you're going really fast for long periods of time. And you need an engine, a warp system that can go really fast for long periods of time. And so I'm not sure that the NX-01 could go as fast for as long as a Daedalus could, even if they theoretically have the same top speed. And it's entirely possible that the next 100 years were primarily about increasing the sustained speed and making the system more reliable and stuff like that. And so, yeah, you might say there hasn't been that much change in speed, but it might be that there's actually been a huge amount of technological improvement under the hood. The other thing that I would point out with that is that if you look at U.S. Navy vessels, An Arleigh Burke is good for about 30 knots. Cruiser in World War II was good for about 30 knots. Destroyers could go a little faster. There were some that could go 35. And, I'm 30 knots plus or minus. The issue there is that there's other factors other than just the power plant. You run into hydrodynamic drag that gives you a maximum top speed because it's exponential. Drag is going up at a cube function, if I remember correctly, and as a result of that, you get to the point where, I want to go a knot faster, so I have to double the size of my engine plant, and I want to go a knot faster than that, so I have to double it again. And so the engineering plant on an Arleigh Burke, it's a gas turbine engine, Reed jet engine. It's a DC-10 engine or DC-8 engine, basically turned into a naval power plant version. And it can power that ship for a long period of time, going really fast in a relatively small footprint. It's not like a big steam plant that you used to have to use for something like that. And so the end result of that is that, it's clearly more sophisticated, it's more fuel efficient, it's more reliable, it gives you faster response, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not any faster. And that has more to do with the fact that water causes drag than it has anything to do with the technology of the ship. Okay, let's see. Yeah, Phantoms burned a lot of fuel with burners. Christopher Buzel says, I like Tony Scott's cinematography better than Ridley's. I have to admit that I haven't actually sat down and sort of figured out who did what on what. I probably should. Wright says that he thinks that F-15EX may have super cruise. I'm not convinced we know everything that the F-15EX can do yet. Now, there's a couple of really good YouTube videos that talk about some of the things that it can do. Like, for instance, it's a fly-by-wire aircraft, and that has all sorts of implications, way more than I ever appreciated, for things like how many weapon stations you can have on board the aircraft. It's got a beast of an engine. And it's a fantastic airplane. But I know that it's not the program manager. I forget exactly what his job is. He said something about it being able to go Mach 3, and then he backed away from that like a week later. He said, no, that's not what I meant. And the funny thing about it is that's a retired brigadier general named Robert Novotny. I knew Major Rob Novotny when he was a student at the War College. He was one of my students. I haven't talked with him since he graduated. So, but I kept hoping that I'd run into him when he was in uniform. But I never did. And now he's working for Boeing. He was a F-15. He was a regular Eagle guy when I knew him, an F-15C guy. He later transitioned to being a Bomb Eagle guy. Yeah, One Horse Shade talks about the cruise speed being warp 6, and then when they did the refit, it goes up to warp 8. There's some really interesting things with all of that. Even aside from the fact that the warp scale changed and all that, there's some really interesting things about how you get to those high warp speeds. And in one of them, I talked about how my working hypothesis for the Constellation class is, okay, taking 2 steps back. The deflector is a warp generator. It is generating a warp field that is sort of blowing all the shit out of the way in front. And that's one of the reasons why you can go fast, is that you don't have to worry about running into something. And so you can use the screens, you can use the navigational deflector, you can muck with the warp engines to do stuff like that and play with the warp field, because it's all the same technology in different flavors of the same technology. And so Starfleet at one point decided on that the right way, at least to do ships that were designed to go really fast for long periods of time, i.e. explorers that have to get out to the periphery, that the right way to do that was to have a dedicated warp device known as a navigational deflector to do that job and not try to muck around with the engines doing it. You have a dedicated device. I think the constellation was them basically saying, we think that the right answer is now, maybe the right answer is just to have 4 engines rather than 2. And as a result, you've got enough excess warp field generation capability that you don't need a navigational deflector. And instead, you're playing games with the warp field on the engines. And they apparently decided they didn't like that answer. And why they didn't like that answer, I don't know. Maybe it didn't work as well in practice as they thought. Maybe there had been a breakthrough in deflector technology that shifted the balance back the other way. Maybe it worked perfectly fine, but it led to increased maintenance costs. Maybe the crazy guy who had that idea stopped being chief of Starfleet design and he left, and the next guy said, no, we're going to go back to the old way of doing it. If you want to understand how these things work, read about the British Navy in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century. There's all sorts of analogs for how the politics and how design decisions get made and stuff like that. Another good place to read stuff is the Honor Harrington books. David does a pretty good job of talking through stuff like ship designs become obsolete because they had a breakthrough, what would otherwise appear to be a relatively minor breakthrough in inertial compensator technology. And now you can meet your goal with a bigger ship. You've got a specific goal of how much acceleration you want. And that's sort of what they all aim for. And now you can meet that goal with a bigger ship. And so basically it's like, oh, now everybody's building super dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts are obsolete. And so like, that's why you don't have battleships in that universe. Well, you do. Manticore never built the battleships. They just weren't building a big battle fleet at the time that battleships were the cutting edge of technology. They started off with dreadnoughts, which were the follow-on class. Haven built battleships. Now they've got all these battleships that are effectively obsolete for the line of battle, but Haven has an internal security problem. And so basically their internal security force is armed with capital ships. In this case, old shitty capital ships called battleships, but they give them to the state sec guys, and state sec uses them to suppress rebellions and stuff like that. So it's sort of the sort of thing that you'd expect the Galactic Empire to do. Maybe we're not going to fight the fleet action with these things, but we're going to go do internal security, that sort of thing. Okay, let's scroll down. Chris Buzel says that's a hybrid electric system, though, right? If you're talking about the Arleigh Burke, the answer is no, it's not. It's direct drive. It's actually, there's a reduction gear. The single most expensive piece of gear on an Arleigh Burke is the reduction gear. And I believe it is the case that the United States Navy does not buy it. They rent it. They lease it long term. I believe that is the case, but it is the single most expensive piece of gear, like in terms of like one part number on the entire ship. But they're talking about electric drive because at least in theory you get a bunch of advantages. Like you can put the power generation anywhere. You don't have to like build around a shaft. You can put the power generation anywhere, and you can avoid some of the reduction gear issues, at least in theory. Now, a lot of electric vehicles do have transmissions because, as it turns out, it's still useful to have gears. You get a mechanical advantage from having gears in certain circumstances. And even though theoretically, in theory and practice are the same, and practice are oftentimes different. Theoretically, with an electric motor, you can just sort of dial it to whatever you want it to be, and you should get the same performance. But in reality, that doesn't really work. They're optimized for certain things because of how they're made, what they're made of, et cetera, et cetera. And so sometimes you find yourself in a situation where, yeah, it turns out we need a gearbox after all. So, Yeah, Ryan Szymanski did an episode in the reduction grid of the Battleship New Jersey. Everything that Ryan Szymanski does is worth a look. Now, I will point out that I don't think that he's an architect. Yeah, I don't think he's a naval architect. I think he's an engineer and he's a conservation guy, etc. But this isn't a slam. It's more along the lines of he spent a lot of time studying that stuff, etc. But I don't think he ever had to pass the test, right, to get the degree. The other thing is that and you run into this with a bunch of those YouTube channels, like Drakinifel in particular is a guy who I'm thinking of. When he's talking about the history of something, like the ship design history, or like how they brought the ships back from Pearl Harbor, he does meticulous research, and he does a great job about that. He's less good when he starts talking about tactics and operational doctrine. And Szymanski doesn't talk about tactics and operational doctrine very much, but every now and then he does. And he's less good when he talks about that stuff. And, hey, that's not a bad thing. It's not it's not their Jeopardy category, right? And so, everybody's got their Jeopardy categories. Everybody has the things that they're sort of like adjacent to, but it's not their specialty. And they're less good on those things. There are certainly things that I'm involved with my day job that I'm less good on this piece of it than I am on that piece of it. I know a lot less about Air Force doctrine, about how the Air Force does its thing than how the Navy does its thing, despite the fact, I'm going to tell you where I work. I work for the Air Force. Everybody, if there's anybody out there who hasn't figured out that the guy who works right next to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, if you haven't figured out that I work for the Air Force, then hey, that's great. But I'm not ignorant about like airplane tactics and stuff like that, but it's something I haven't studied to the same degree that I've studied the other stuff. So I understand a lot more about how a naval base works than I do how an Air Force base works, despite the fact I actually like an air base with actual airplanes on it. My base does not have airplanes. Actually, that's technically not true. My base has a metric shit ton of airplanes on it. As a general rule, they've only got one of each, and they were demilitarized decades ago when they moved them into the museum. It's a great museum, by the way. You should come look. Let's see. Yep, I love me some Drock too. If we can ever get up to Quincy to tour the USS Salem, yeah, I'd love to hear you do your 3-inch 50 twin Mark 33 talk. And yeah, I love the XB70 also. They've got an SR-71 and an A-12, which is kind of interesting. That there's not very many places that have both. There's frequently places that have one or the other, but they actually have both, and they've got multiple Phantoms, and there's a couple of other airplanes that got multiple versions of. Generally, airplanes that had long histories. Okay. I think that I'm going to declare victory here. I'm at the hour and 28-minute mark. At one point, I was afraid that I was going too fast and I was going to rush right through it, because I did intentionally rush through some parts because I knew that I was going to slow down at the end when I started talking about redesigning the ships, etc. And so, as always, I would like to say I am always honored by the fact that there is a group of people that for some reason have decided that they'd like to spend their Saturday nights listening to me talk, and me and whoever's on the show with me talk about starships. And so I really appreciate the fact that you're willing to do that. And I intend to continue doing it. I have no plans to stop doing this anytime soon, although the schedule is going to get kind of wonky as I try to move. But thank you very much, everybody. And hopefully I'll see you next week. I'll keep looking, keep checking YouTube to see what the notices say. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Have a good evening.